Welcome to another episode of The Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Today, my guest, Gabriel Gaarden, another segment of Making Sense with Gabriel. Stick around. We'll be right back. Hi, Gabriel. Welcome back to The Vegan Pulse with another segment of Making Sense with Gabriel.
Hi, Nancy.
My question for you today came from one of our viewers, and it says, I'm going to read it because it's a little lengthy. How can I verify that fermented raw vegetables made at home will be safe to eat, since the natural process of food decomposition, also known as rotting or spoiling, seems to be linked with the process of fermentation? Woohoo! Got that?
That's a great question. You know, I have to be honest with viewers right off the top. This isn't something, at least in terms of looking into like evidence-based peer-reviewed information, that I've seen a lot of research on. And it's not something that I know a lot about. I think generally fermented foods can be safe. I would just say that I think to some extent, we're going to know whether or not these foods that, yes, they may be to some extent, I honestly don't know the relationship between as the question asker and as the person asked or posited. You know, there's the rotting that's happening, and then there's the fermentation that's happening. And like you say, they may be synonymous to some extent, because I think rotting to some extent takes place because bacteria that are naturally present start to break down. They start to eat away at that food, and that's a big process that happens with the rotting. So there's a buildup of certain bacteria in greater and greater numbers, and then there's a breakdown of that food. They start to break it down and digest it. And that's certainly happening with fermentation, because we know that bacteria have to be involved in order for fermentation to happen. And generally speaking, I guess what comes to my mind when I think about that question is, we have evolved over these eons, you know, millions of years. And so we have a very, very acute and capable and fine-tuned system for being able to tell when something either smells or tastes like it's gone bad, right? And so our bodies are going to let us know, whether it's our taste buds and our smell, right, that give us the capacity to tell whether or not a food, it smells okay or tastes okay. And then also number two, if we get it down, you know, regardless of how it smells or tastes, if we get it down and our body has a negative reaction to it, you know, in the form of either, you know, vomiting or getting sick to our stomach, or sick, having some kind of a feeling ill in our digestive tract, we're going to know whether or not that food is good. And so I think that would be my general recommendation when it comes to fermentation at home, at least. Your body's going to tell you whether or not something's good, whether it's because it either smells or tastes off, or whether it makes you feel bad. And so I would say, hey, you know, go ahead and go after it if you want to ferment foods. The main thing that concerns me with fermentation, coming from a nutrition and a health perspective, is that oftentimes people add a lot of salt. Salt is a very regular ingredient that happens. Say you're making your homemade sauerkraut. You've got your cabbage and whatever spices you put into your sauerkraut dish, and then you add a ton of salt to it. Well, salt is one of the diets that are too high in salt. They're very common in countries like the United States and elsewhere throughout the world. And eating too much salt is one of the biggest risk factors when it comes to both disease as well as death. So it's going to take life away from our years, and it's going to take years away from our lives when we consume too much salt. And so I guarantee you, most people are eating way more salt than is recommended in the dietary guidelines and recommended by the American Heart Association, because we know that salt intake is the leading factor, or the leading risk factor for hypertension, which is known as high blood pressure, right? And high blood pressure is the leading risk factor for heart disease. So think about heart attacks and strokes. And we know that heart disease is the leading killer of men and women in the United States. And so, tracking back to salt, we know that we need to consume less salt. And so when you're doing fermentation foods, I would say just be aware that we need to consume less food. So if there's a fermented food that you really love that you want to incorporate, I wouldn't tell people not to do that. I would just say don't eat them in very liberal amounts, right? So you might just put a spoonful of sauerkraut on top of your veggie burger or on top of some other vegetable dish that you really love, beans and rice or whatever it may be, because it has that very strong flavor that people grow to love. And so if eating a little bit of sauerkraut or other fermented foods helps you to eat more of the whole plant foods that we know support our health, more beans, more vegetables and fruits, more whole grains, more herbs and spices, more nuts and seeds, these whole plant foods that don't have added sodium in them when we begin, then great. But don't eat them in super large amounts, or even consider, hey, if I love pickles or some other fermented food that's really high in salt, well, maybe at least I could slice them up and I could put them in a colander and I could run them under running water for a minute or two and really rinse them off really good. So the pickles are still going to have a lot of salt in them, but at least it's going to take some of the salt away, right? And you could do the same thing with sauerkraut. It's still going to have a salty flavor, but maybe you rinse it off if you know that you really need to be mindful of your salt intake, because we know a lot of Americans, millions and millions of Americans already have hypertension. They already have high blood pressure. Now, if you're somebody who's normotensive, meaning you have completely normal blood pressure, then you don't have to worry as much about getting that salt intake down as low as possible. You still have to be mindful, because we all want to be mindful of our salt intake, but you might not have to worry about rinsing it off before you eat it. But I say still think of it more as a condiment, right? Something that we're going to use a little bit of to just add a little bit of flavor and variety and a new texture to our dish, but add it to foods that have not been salted, right? So eat whole beans, whole grains that haven't been cooked in a load of sodium, a load of salt, and then just use those fermented foods as a way to add some flavor and variety to our meals.
That's awesome. Because that's what I usually do. I have like rice and beans, and then sometimes I'll put a little maybe kimchi on the side,
Exactly.
but not a lot.
That would be a wonderful thing to do.
It tastes good, and it's not so much, like you said, that you're taking so much of that salt in.
Exactly. And then you're still getting some of those fermented foods from the standpoint of, fermented foods are kind of a hot topic because they have some of those bacteria in them, which have been implicated with the health of our microbiome, right? That eating the fermented foods is good for the diversity of our microbiome. Those are our gut bugs, right? Our gut bacteria. And so from that standpoint, it can be good to eat these fermented foods. I would just say, yes, be mindful of the amount. We don't need to be eating loads of these. Just think of it as a little topping to add some flavor and variety, and that'll allow you to get that fermentation, some of those extra good bacteria, into your gut.
Awesome. So there's no really tried and true. Well, there are recipes out there how to ferment and stuff like that, but there's no real tried and true, like you have to ferment it for this many days, and if you pass those days, it's going to be no good to eat. That's
a great question. Like I say, I'm not because I've always been so mindful of my sodium consumption, because I know it's one of the leading risk factors for disease and death in the United States and all over the world. I'm not a big fermenter. And so again, the best way, people think a lot about fermentation as a way to take care of our microbiome, but I want to tell people that the best way to take care of your microbiome is to eat loads of different whole plant foods, because it's really the whole plant foods that have many different kinds of fiber in them that create the prebiotics. Prebiotics just basically mean food for the probiotics, and the probiotics are our gut bugs, right? And so the more different kinds of plants you're eating, different colors, different varieties, different types of plants, they all have different fibers in them. They all have their own different mixture of fibers. And when they get down into our large intestine, where our gut bugs live, they are the food. The fiber is the food for our gut bugs. The more variety of the fiber, the more diversity, healthy, rich diversity of gut bugs we're going to have. And that has all kinds of implications downstream for our long-term health. We want a diverse microbiome. The best way to do that is with a diversity of plant foods, not eating more fermented foods. So don't worry so much about the fermented foods as a way to get a healthy gut. Worry more about eating lots of different kinds of plants for having a healthy microbiome.
So the fiber, once again, is the key.
Fiber's king and queen.
All right. Thank you for sharing with us again, Gabriel. See you next time. Thank you for watching another episode of The Vegan Pulse. I am your host, Nancy Arenas. Follow us on Facebook, check out our blog, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Live vegan.